Welcome to the Fulbright-Hays Doctoral Dissertation Research Abroad Fellow Alumni Session. I'm joined by my Department of Education colleague, Amy Marion, and previous DDRA Fellows, Dr. Ashlee Dauphinais Civitello, Dr. Keshia Harris, and Dr. David Krolikoski. Today, we'll be asking our panelists about their own DDRA research and findings, benefits to being part of the Fulbright network, and advice for potential DDRA applicants. First, a brief overview of the program. The Fulbright-Hays Doctoral Dissertation Research Abroad Fellowship Program provides opportunities to doctoral candidates to engage in dissertation research abroad in modern foreign languages and area studies. The program is designed to contribute to the development and improvement of the study of modern foreign languages and area studies in the United States. Since its inception, the program has funded thousands of doctoral students whose research has contributed to deeper knowledge about areas of the world generally not included in U.S. curricula. The projects range from across all fields of study across the globe. Without further ado, let's hear from our panelists about their own DDRA research. Keshia, why don't you tell us a little bit about your DDRA project?
Absolutely, I would be delighted to. So greetings, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. So a little bit about myself. I'm an author, a speaker, and a researcher, and I use mixed methods research to essentially understand how social experiences impact the identity and mental health of African descent and Latin American adolescents. For my DDRA project, which I loved, I conducted a mixed method study with high school students in Brazil and Colombia. And the goal of my project was to evaluate how academic experiences and post-secondary goals varied by race, skin color, and socioeconomic status. So some of the specific variables that I researched were grades, perceived discrimination, access to school resources, and racial and national identity. And in my current role, I work as a research associate at the Rene Crown Wellness Institute at the University of Colorado Boulder. And in collaboration with a team of youth and undergraduate researchers, I've designed a wellness and mental health program for Black high school girls in Colorado. And the program is called Girls Like Us. So thank you. Thank you for the lovely invitation.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Keshia. And Ashlee, why don't you tell us a little about your project?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ashlee Dauphinais Civitello. I am currently an assistant professor in the Department of Foreign Languages at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. My background is in linguistics and anthropology, so I'm kind of the intersection of those two fields. And for my Fulbright-Hays doctoral dissertation research, I conducted a mixed method study, both ethnographic and linguistic, in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. I studied the role of language in the construction of community and in doctor-patient interactions for a group of women who have an intersex genetic condition called Turner syndrome. It's a chromosomal condition that can result in a lot of different ramifications for the body, but broadly speaking, I'm interested in what is the role of the body for the intersex people in constructing both communities of practice in medical practices and also linguistic practices. And I was there in 2019.
Fantastic, thank you. And David?
Hi everyone, my name is David Krolikoski. I'm currently assistant professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. My field is Korean literature, and my project for Fulbright was to look at where I was trying to understand the beginning of modern poetry, what we understand to be modern poetry in Korea. So it was primarily an archival research project. I was going to archives and libraries looking for newspapers, journals, poetry collections that were very tough to find anywhere else, and collecting a lot of material and then using that material to kind of reconstruct a literary history primarily from the colonial period. So it was a very useful and enriching trip for me, and was the basis of my dissertation, which is now my first book project, which I'm currently finishing up. So it's still very fresh and important to my daily life, even right now.
Well, thank you all so much for those great introductions. You've done some really interesting and impressive work. So we want to hear a little bit more about your research and what we and some tips that we can give to people who are considering applying for the DDRA. So to start off with, you all traveled to Brazil, Colombia, South Korea. So would one of you be able to tell us one of the most significant findings from your research that you conducted as part of your DDRA? And if anyone wants to go first, feel free to just unmute yourself.
I'm happy to go first. So I would say that one of the most significant findings from my research was that I was looking to see how post-secondary goals varied by some of the socioeconomic variables and demographics that I had mentioned. And what I had found was that post-secondary goals in terms of the type of professions and the type of educational level of education that the participants desired to have after high school did not vary by any of those demographics. So they didn't vary by race or skin color or even socioeconomic status. So that was really interesting, and it actually aligns a lot with literature in the US on a similar topic. But what I did find was that experiences of discrimination and poverty level was much more significant among the adolescents of darker skin tone. So what that highlights is it speaks to the prevalence of colorism and the impact of colorism on the outcomes, the academic outcomes and the social outcomes of today's youth, specifically in Latin America.
Wow, okay, yeah, thank you. Ashlee, anything you would like to add about your research?
Sure. I also, in my research, found that discourses surrounding the body and identifying at levels like chromosomes and hormones were really prominent ways that women with this intersex condition with Turner syndrome construct a community and understood themselves. And some of this is relevant in the fact that a lot of feminist scholarship in explaining the sex versus gender difference, for example, is really rooted in, well, sex is messy, gender and sex are different, sex is biological, gender is social, that's the typical story. And obviously people, always are like, well, sex is really messy because we have all these differences, biologically speaking. And it's kind of this cornerstone of gender research, but there's been almost no work on intersex individuals from an ethnographic perspective in particular. So most of the work has just been from the medical side. And, in some of the modern, current research in language and gender, it really looks at the role of the social. And I was interested in, okay, but where does that leave the body then, especially for people who are born into what may be considered non-normative bodies, or as my participants identified, second class women. So where does that leave the body, right? And I was really interested in how they use medicalized discourse to understand themselves. So my findings show that across linguistic and social practices, the body was really centered in a way that maybe other groups don't conceive of the body in quite the same way from a gender and sex perspective, but it was really significant in my group. And I think it, now that there's a bunch of research coming out that's in linguistics and anthropology looking more at non-binary trans populations, I think it was significant in adding the intersex perspective to this larger discussion that's been going on about differences in gender, sexuality, sex from all different perspectives.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. David?
Yeah, I guess I can say as when I'm doing archival research, I tend to be very pessimistic about what I'm going to find. I always go in with a plan and there are presumptions, and then I kind of expect to only get maybe 50% or 60% just based on what is extant and available. And a lot of the questions that I have and people have in my field, they're questions that often can't be answered directly. A lot of the people all of the people who I work on are dead, so I can't just go up to them, find them, and ask them. And so I was really pleasantly surprised while doing my archival research by kind of the things that I found that were directly, answering some of the questions that I had. I was, a lot of my research is dealing with questions of why, poets chose to write in certain languages, why a Korean poet would choose to write in Japanese. And I was, pleasantly surprised to find, letters, talking about working through these issues. And I think, one of the major takeaways, after doing that archival research was really coming to the understanding that translation, is specifically literary translation, is something that transformed over time. The way they thought about it in the 1910s and the 1920s is very different from the way we think about it today. They were using it in a very different way. And for them, it was very instrumental as a way to kind of learn how to write vernacular literature, which at the time was a very kind of new practice for them. So they're essentially translating a poem from, French into Korean without knowing what, there's no kind of equivalent form in Korean at the time. So it's a very kind of, it's about kind of creation and imagining what that would look like. Whereas today, if I'm translating a poem between languages, I know what a poem looks like in English, I know what it looks like in the other language. I have that basis, but they didn't have that back then. And it's, doing that archival research allowed me to kind of think historically and put my mind in that different space and look at it from their perspective.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Very interesting research that all of you were doing. So thank you for providing just a snippet of, I know there's so much more that you discovered. So that was really great just to get a snapshot of what you've been or what you were doing during the DDRA. So um, while you were doing this research, you were, a Fulbright-Hays fellow in your host country. So I'm curious, were any of you able to utilize that Fulbright network when you were in country, whether you were working with the Fulbright Commission or other Fulbright folks that you met along the way? Could you tell us about that?
I can go ahead. I did fairly extensively. When I first when I was awarded the fellowship and got the list of other people who were in the country, I reached out to people who were also in Brazil, and we kind of formed a WhatsApp group, and we started to connect that way. I think sometimes with Fulbright-Hays, because everyone's kind of arriving maybe on a slightly different date, or they're there for a slightly different period. Sometimes we overlapped, sometimes we didn't by very much, but we were all in touch. And then I also connected with some of the people in the Fulbright IIE program who were in Fulbright Brazil specifically as well. So the Fulbright-Hays network in particular, with the people who were in Rio, I was lucky to be there with other people who are also anthropologists. So we spent a lot of time talking, about how research is going. And it was nice to have someone else who was in the same position, right? When you first get there, you're like, how do I use my time? Am I on track? Am I not on track? And it was nice to have someone else to share those experiences with.
Sure.
And yeah, some of the other people who were in Brazil, we met up and talked a lot about research, and we're still in touch to this day about our findings. So it's great to have that scholarly network even several years later.
That's nice to hear. Keshia?
Yes. So I actually had a very similar experience to Ashlee. So I connected with other DDRA fellows who were conducting research in Brazil and in Latin America. But similar to what Ashlee said, our time in the host countries didn't necessarily overlap. But what I found in terms of support, and I also I was in Salvador, Brazil. And some of the scholars that were there were in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo or other parts of Brazil. But what I found most useful was the logistical support and also the emotional support. So logistical in terms of, what type of visa you need and just certain qualifications that we have to meet. As people and scholars in the host country, and also just meeting the Fulbright requirements. And then also just, the unique experience of collecting primary data engaging in primary data collection in a foreign country. So it was really that support group and that network was really helpful in that way.
That's great to hear. David, do you want to add anything?
I can just say it was, very similar for me as well. I think I connected before I actually went to Korea at the time. I think it was probably Facebook that I was using, to connect with other Fulbright people who were either in Korea or going to Korea. And then when I was actually there, formed connections primarily with people doing IIE Fulbrights at the time. And it was just nice to have, again, a group of people who, from other universities that I got to know and form connections with. And we were dealing with similar things, how do you manage your time, or, where did you make, where's a good place to find this kind of thing, et cetera, et cetera. So it was nice to have that kind of group to rely on that was kind of in a similar position.
Yeah, I'm glad that you all were able to do a little bit of networking and connecting with other folks, because I think in addition to doing the research, it's nice to have other people to talk to who are in the same position. So glad to hear that. So we are hoping to provide some practical advice to people in the future who are looking to apply for the DDRA. The DDRA runs a competition every year. So do you all have any tips for people who are considering applying, the application process, developing their research proposal, or collecting letters of affiliation, any of those things, or anything beyond that as well? We'd love to hear any advice that you have. David, do you have any advice to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I guess, practically speaking, what I would tell my students now is, to start early, especially trying to get those letters of affiliation. And, as a graduate student at the time, it can be very intimidating to reach out to, very, different people I've never met before to talk about my project. But when I actually did it, it actually wasn't scary. And a lot of these people were very helpful to me, even if they, felt like they themselves couldn't write a letter for me, they could, tell me about someone else. I workshopped a lot of my materials before I sent in the actual application. My University of Chicago, was very helpful in that respect. So I talked with advisors. I did multiple drafts of my materials, and because it is a kind of different thing than just your dissertation proposal, because you want to make your project legible to people who don't do what you do or don't understand why what you do is important necessarily. And it's a kind of different way of thinking about things. And I think it's both useful for this application, but it's just also useful in general, since a lot of the people you're going to be talking to in your life are not in your field, and you want to be able to communicate with them and tell them about what you're doing. And hopefully the stakes of your project have larger ramifications than just your tiny field, even though that's kind of your first audience as someone working in academia.
Yeah, those are some excellent points. Starting early, of course, workshopping your application, utilizing your advisors, not being scared to reach out, just make that connection, and maybe it'll lead to another connection. Those are all really great points. So, Keshia, did you want to add something to that?
I do have something to add. So I would say for me, the number one resource was, I also graduated from the University of Chicago, was the U Chicago grad office. Because they have so many, every year they're engaging or supporting graduate students through the process of applying for fellowships, and specifically Fulbright DDRA Fellowships. And so what was most helpful was that they had templates in terms of the letters of affiliation, so that I could send that to folks and say, okay, this is the type of letter that I'm interested in, and that way people have something to work with and have a foundation or an example. And then similar to what David mentioned in terms of workshopping. So having that support system in the New Chicago grad office of someone who will go through each of your materials in the application and critique it, because I will say the committee, the Fulbright committee does pay attention to detail. And so having someone else who has already reviewed material for previous years and already has an extensive amount of experience, they can give the feedback that you really need. And so I have to say, I have felt tremendously supported by our graduate office in that way. And I just highly recommend, going to talk to them early, even if students don't feel like they have all of their ideas in place, because they can even help. Each institution has this type of support. So that would be my number one piece of advice.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great point. And for anyone who's listening and they're not sure where to go at their university, you can always reach out to the DDRA team, and we'll have our contact information at the end. But if you don't know where to go, do reach out to us and we'll make sure you're connected at your university. Ashlee.
Yeah, I echo everyone else's comments wholeheartly, especially starting early. I remember my first contact, someone else in my program was awarded a Fulbright-Hays 3 years before me. And during his process, we were colleagues because we had the same advisor. So I was watching him go through the process and seeing someone, he encouraged me to start thinking about how I would frame my project 4 years before I even applied, right? And that might feel daunting, right? But there's so many moving parts, right? Because you have to think about your language abilities and how are you going to demonstrate your language abilities. You have to start making connections, and you never know what can happen. As we know from the past couple of years, there could be any sort of event get in the way of your initial plan. So you need plan A, you need a plan B if your affiliations don't come through. You maybe need to think about preliminary research, figure out who the point person is on your university. So all those things can take some time to wrap your head around your project. And so definitely starting early is something I'd recommend. Also, reaching out to other DDRAs. I mean, a lot of people I had contact to are very happy to share their experiences if you're curious about what it was like, just to get the experience, because I think it's kind of a unique grant writing process or fellowship application than other more field specific grants, because this is area studies. So you're writing for a slightly different audience than your grad program might have trained you to write for. So being in conversation with people from the area, from other fields, but who work in the area is also, I think, another suggestion. Get people to look at it and get feedback from people who aren't just from your subfield or your field, right?
Yeah, I think several of you mentioned having people read it who might not be familiar with your research, just to make sure that when your application does go through the review process through the Department of Education, anyone who's reading it will be able to understand what your topic is, which will obviously make your application stronger. So yeah, those are all really excellent points. So just a couple of more questions to go. And this next one, I actually don't know if there's anything else to say. We had a question about resources that you utilize. So we mentioned, the grad studies office at your university, project director, your friends, your colleagues, the DDRA Alumni Network. You can reach out to, it's typically your project director at your university, but like I said before, you could always reach out to the DDRA team if you're totally stuck. Are there any other resources that you all could think of that we should recommend to our applicants? And if not, that's okay.
I would say that the host institutions are also a really great resource. So the organization or institution that applicants receive their letters of affiliation from, I would say, because in my experience, my dissertation advisor was incredibly supportive, but she hadn't actually ever conducted research in either of the countries where I was conducting research. And so I really did utilize the support of those host institutions to help me with networking, with getting into the schools to recruit youth for my studies. So, I mean, that might be a little bit different in terms of pre-preparation, but I would give some attention to networking in the host countries themselves as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think something that David said earlier mentioned like reaching out to people, whether that is the institution in the other country or just someone you heard about. And even if they can't help you, maybe they can recommend someone else. So just making that first step to reach out, and in the host country, as you mentioned, Keshia, is a good place to do that to strengthen your connections and hopefully your DDRA application. So great point. Anything else, David or Ashlee, on the resource front?
I guess I can just say that I've had other people contact me. You know, I guess they must have heard that I did the program before, and people I had maybe met once at like a conference, and they reached out and asked about my experiences, and I've always tried to help those people, and so I think that can be also useful if you hear that even if someone that you don't know personally, it doesn't hurt to ask, and typically I'm happy to share my resources, and so that can be another avenue to go.
Yeah, so that alumni network, yeah, so you can talk to your project director about past DDRA fellows. We also, I believe, have all of the projects listed on our website each year, so you could kind of scour that list a little bit if you go on the DDRA webpage, or if any of you use LinkedIn, that's another good way to search for Fulbright-Hays fellows and make that connection. So thanks. So we're getting close to wrapping up. I think this has been a really awesome panel. I've loved hearing from all of you, hearing about your research and how we can better prepare future applicants. So my last question is just kind of to wrap it all up. So I just want to ask, what does your Fulbright-Hays DDRA mean to you? So maybe we could start with Ashlee.
Sure. It's hard to put into words because the Fulbright-Hays DDRA has been not only my experience in the country, right? Conducting field work was, I had a really positive experience, and I was able to write the dissertation and now book project that I had always dreamed about. And I think this really opened doors for me in a lot of other ways. So, it really gave me the time to let some of my ideas, to actually collect some of that data that I needed, that I don't think I would have been supported by almost any other program. So it really has meant my whole degree essentially in current position. So, and also the contacts that I made during that like both in country, other Fulbright-Hays alumni, those are people who I now have this network with for the rest of my academic career, hopefully. So that's also, both on a personal side and then a career side, it's I don't know where I would be if I hadn't done the Fulbright-Hays. So
Thanks, Ashlee. That's wonderful to hear. Keshia?
Sure. For me, what the Fulbright-Hays DDRA Fellowship meant was and is a pathway to fulfill my dreams. It's something that I had aspired to accomplish even when I was an adolescent and I'd heard about Fulbright-Hays. And I was able to conduct a comparative mixed method study with multiple languages, Spanish and Portuguese, and then I wrote in English. And it's such a unique program to really support that type of complexity and cultural exchange and just learning about different types of methodology, and then really learning how to be an autonomous researcher is just a huge value. And similar to Ashlee, I lived with host families. And so now I have family in those countries who I definitely still keep in contact with. So for me, it's definitely a pathway towards achieving my dreams.
Thanks, Keshia. That's really nice. And I'm glad that you mentioned your language study as well and doing the research in other languages, because that is a really big component of the DDRA program, is utilizing other languages in your research. So, and last but not least, David.
It was a very kind of similar experience to me. I would not have been able to write the dissertation that I wrote without Fulbright. I wouldn't be able to do my job right now to the same degree without the connections that I made. My field, Korean literature, in terms of kind of English language scholarship, is relatively young, and we tend to work very closely with scholars in South Korea. It's just really important for all of us to be very aware of what's happening there. And so the year that I was abroad, helped me build those connections. It helped me meet and talk to a number of scholars who were experts in my field and get advice and have them look at kind of work in progress chapters. And, all of those things would not have been possible without Fulbright. So it's really hard to imagine me being where I am without having this opportunity.
Thanks, David. And thank you all for that. That was really nice to hear. And I'm so glad that it was a worthwhile experience and you all are doing great things in your field. So we really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us and to help future DDRA fellows submit their applications and make them stronger and hopefully successful DDRA applicants. Is there anything else anyone wants to add before we wrap up officially? Okay. Oh, Ashlee?
I'll just say, I think sometimes I've heard other people who want to apply get daunted by, there's moving parts and is it worth it? And I say, yes, it's a great investment of your time. It really helps you think through your project in a way that a lot of other grants don't have you think through. So I know it seems like a lot of moving parts to get together, but it's definitely worth it.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we'll wrap things up. Thank you all again for taking the time to chat with us and contribute to all the resources that we're hoping to support our applicants to the DDRA program and grow the program and build on everyone's really, valuable research projects around the world. So thank you and take care, everybody.